One family rose from country gentry to the throne of England in a single generation. Then, in the space of a few short years, that same family was destroyed. A queen was executed. Her brother was executed 2 days before her. Her father lived just long enough to watch it happen. And decades later, another Boleyn wife would kneel at the same execution block. According to the accounts passed down since, none of them fully left. Figures said to be theirs have been reported inside the Tower of London, along the driveways of Norfolk estates, in the gardens of a Kentish childhood home, and within the ruins of a manor in Essex. This is the story of the Boleyn family in the years after their fall. Their rise to power made history. What is said to have followed, it has never been fully explained. Hever Castle sits in the Kent countryside, a moated manor house that had been the Boleyn family home for generations before it became known for anything else. It was here, in 1539, that Sir Thomas Boleyn died. He was in his early 60s. Sir Thomas was father to Mary, Anne, and George. By the time he died, he had outlived 2 of his children. Thomas had spent his life building influence at court. He arranged advantageous marriages, secured positions close to the king, and positioned his family for a rise that few in England could match. When his daughter Anne caught the attention of King Henry VIII, Thomas rose with her, gaining titles and land. But when the marriage collapsed and the charges against Anne and her brother George were brought forward, Thomas did not intervene. He kept his own position and said nothing in their defense. Both of his children were executed within the same week. 3 years later, he was dead as well. In the centuries since, a very different story has attached itself to his name. According to folklore that took shape long after his death, Thomas Boleyn did not simply pass away and rest. The legend holds that he was cursed, condemned to spend 1,000 years paying for his silence. The haunting is said to centre on Blickling Hall, the family's ancestral home in Norfolk. Each year, on the anniversary of his children's executions, witnesses claim that a black carriage appears at the estate gates as midnight strikes. It is pulled by 4 horses, all of them headless. The coachman driving it has no head either. Inside sits Sir Thomas, and he too is without his head, holding it beneath his arm as the carriage races forward. This part is strange as he was not beheaded. However, that is how the tale is told. His task, according to the story, is to cross a set of ancient stone bridges scattered across the Norfolk countryside before the first rooster crows at dawn. Some versions name 12 bridges, others describe more. Locals have long pointed to specific crossings said to be part of the route, among them the bridges at Aylsham, Coltishall and Wroxham, each one a real physical structure still standing today. The telling goes that Thomas never completes the circuit. Some versions say he is pursued the entire way by shrieking, unseen figures, their cries mixing with the sound of hooves on stone. Between one bridge and the next, witnesses have described hearing a carriage pass at speed, though nothing is ever seen crossing. By the time the last bridge comes into view, dawn has already broken and the coach is gone. There is no official record of anyone claiming to have seen the carriage complete its route, and no account offers an explanation for why the ritual is fixed to that particular night, or why it returns each year without fail. What remains is a story tied to a real family, a real death, and a stretch of Norfolk Road that locals still associate with the sound of something passing through the dark. George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, was the only son of Sir Thomas and the elder brother of Queen Anne. By his mid-20s, he had already built a reputation as a skilled diplomat and a gifted linguist, trusted with delicate negotiations on behalf of the crown. His future at court seemed secure. Then, in the spring of 1536, everything changed. George was arrested alongside his sister and accused of incest with her, a charge historians now widely regard as fabricated to secure Anne's downfall. There was little evidence presented at trial beyond rumour and coerced testimony, but the outcome had already been decided. On the 17th of May, 1536, George was beheaded on Tower Green. He was executed 2 days before his sister, the first of the family to die that week. According to local tradition, George's spirit did not settle quietly. Unlike his father, who is said to arrive at Blickling Hall inside a carriage, the stories describe George's fate as more violent. On the same night, each year that the carriage is said to appear, his headless figure is described being dragged across the Norfolk countryside, pulled behind 4 headless horses along the same route his father is condemned to race. Other versions of the tale place him even closer to his father's torment. In some tellings, he runs behind the coach as it races between the bridges, a mangled figure trying and failing to keep pace. In others, his severed head is said to hang from the side of the carriage itself, swinging where a lantern would normally sit, casting a pale light over the road ahead. When his figure is described apart from the carriage, witnesses have spoken of a headless shape moving slowly through the wooded paths near Blickling, pacing back and forth along the same stretch of ground, never quite leaving it. Some accounts place him at the Tower of London as well, his figure seen pacing the corridors near where he was held before his trial, a quiet presence compared to the more dramatic sightings tied to Norfolk. What remains consistent across the tales is the sense of a man without agency even in death, dragged along a path he never chose, tied permanently to the fate of the family that raised him and then failed to protect him. He was the first of the family to die that week in 1536. 2 days later, his sister would follow him to the same scaffold, and it was her story that would come to define the family's haunted legacy more than any other. Anne Boleyn was executed on the 19th of May, 1536, on Tower Green, within the walls of the Tower of London. She was beheaded not with the traditional axe, but with a sword, wielded by a swordsman brought specially from France for the purpose, a small mercy that allowed for a single swift stroke rather than the repeated blows common at the time. Of all the ghosts said to belong to her family, none is described more often, or in more places than hers. Anne's rise had been extraordinary. She refused to become the king's mistress and held out instead for marriage, a decision that led Henry VIII to break from Rome and reshape the religious structure of England entirely. She became queen in 1533 and gave birth to a daughter, the future Elizabeth I. But when she failed to produce a male heir and the king's attention shifted to Jane Seymour, the same court that had elevated her turned against her. Charges of adultery and incest followed. Most historians agree with little real evidence behind them. Her trial lasted a matter of days. Her execution followed soon after. Accounts of her spirit begin at Blickling Hall in Norfolk, believed by some to be her birthplace. On the anniversary of her execution, the story goes that at the stroke of midnight, a carriage arrives at the estate, pulled by headless horses and driven by a headless coachman. Inside sits Anne, dressed in white, holding her own severed head in her lap. As the carriage vanishes, she is said to spend the rest of the night moving through the halls of the house before disappearing again at first light. At Hever Castle in Kent, the family home where she spent much of her childhood, the accounts take on a different character entirely. Here, sightings are said to occur on Christmas Eve, and the figure described is calm rather than frightening. Witnesses have spoken of a quiet, still woman seen crossing the stone bridge over the River Eden, or standing beneath a large oak tree on the castle grounds, the same tree where she and a young Henry are said to have spent time together before either of them held any real power. The most detailed and most frequently repeated sightings, however, come from the Tower of London itself, the site of her final days and her death. In 1817, a sentry patrolling near the White Tower encountered a figure on a staircase late at night. According to the account, the shock of the encounter was severe enough that the guard suffered a fatal heart attack where he stood. Decades later, in 1864, a more detailed account emerged. A sentry stationed near what was then known as the Lieutenant's Lodgings reported a pale, misty figure in Tudor dress approaching him, her feet appearing not to touch the ground. Following procedure, he issued 3 challenges. When the figure did not respond, he charged forward with his bayonet. The blade passed through empty air. A sudden flash of light is said to have travelled up the barrel of his rifle, and the soldier collapsed. He was later found unconscious and was initially charged with sleeping while on duty, an offence that carried serious consequences at the time. He was cleared only after a superior officer, watching from a nearby window, gave a statement confirming that he had seen the same pale figure move toward the sentry and pass directly through the weapon. Later that century, a captain of the guard reported seeing an unexplained light inside the locked Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, the church where Anne's remains were buried following her execution. Climbing a ladder to look through a window, he described witnessing a silent procession moving down the aisle inside, led by a woman whose bearing matched historical portraits of the Queen. The procession is said to have faded before reaching the altar. Taken together, these accounts describe two very different versions of the same figure. At Hever, she is remembered gently, a young woman returning to a place she was happy. At the Tower, she is something closer to a warning, a presence that has, according to these stories, startled grown men into collapse or worse. Whether these are two different reflections of the same spirit, or simply the way a single tragic story has been reshaped by each location that claims her, is a question none of the accounts attempt to answer. Jane Boleyn, born Jane Parker, married George and became part of the family through marriage rather than blood. History has not remembered her kindly. It was her testimony, historians believe, that helped provide the evidence used to condemn both her husband and her sister-in-law in 1536, though whether she acted out of malice, coercion, or fear for her own position remains a matter of debate. What is certain is that her loyalty to the crown did not protect her in the end. 6 years later, Jane found herself entangled in another scandal, this time as lady-in-waiting to Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard. When Catherine's secret meetings with a courtier named Thomas Culpeper came to light, Jane was accused of helping to arrange them. In February of 1542, she was executed on Tower Green, the same ground where George and Anne had died 6 years earlier. In the weeks before her execution, accounts from the time described Jane suffering a severe breakdown, overwhelmed by fear to the point where her sanity was in question. Under English law, a person judged unfit of mind could not lawfully be executed. Henry is said to have sent his own physicians to attend to her, ensuring she was well enough, in the eyes of the law, to face the block. It is this period of terror, more than anything else, that is said to have left its mark on the Tower grounds. Among the accounts tied to Jane, one modern encounter on Tower Green is described in more detail than any other. A witness reported hearing a sudden, desperate scream cut through the quiet of the grounds, followed by the sight of a woman running in a panic. She wore fine grey clothing, torn and dirtied at the hem, her hair loose and disordered, her face marked with distress. As the figure stumbled and appeared to fall, the witness instinctively reached out to catch her. Instead of contact with another person, the witness described a sensation like being struck by something hard and intensely cold, enough force to knock them backward onto the stone ground. For a moment afterward, the witness reported losing consciousness entirely, and upon waking, described a brief and disorienting sense of having been somewhere else, in a small stone room heavy with the smell of candle wax, in the final hours before an execution not their own. No other account tied to the Boleyn family describes quite this kind of encounter, one that seems to place the witness, however briefly, inside the experience itself rather than simply observing it. Whether this reflects something particular to Jane's final days, or simply the intensity with which her story has been told and retold since, is not something the record explains. She is remembered, more often than not, as the woman who helped bring down a queen. But at Hampton Court, and on the ground where she herself was executed, the accounts suggest a woman still caught in the same fear that consumed her in those final weeks, unable, it seems, to leave it behind. Mary Boleyn was the eldest of the Boleyn children, and for a time her path seemed set apart from her siblings' fate. Before Anne caught the king's attention, Mary had already been Henry's mistress, a relationship that produced 2 children whose true parentage remains a subject of debate among historians to this day. Unlike her sister, Mary never sought the crown for herself. Her later life took an unexpected turn. Following the death of her first husband, Mary married again, this time to a soldier named William Stafford, a man with no title and no standing at court. The match scandalized her family and led to her banishment. She retired to Rochford Hall, a moated manor in Essex built with turrets and winding courtyards that had belonged to the Boleyns for generations. She died there in July of 1543, quietly, and by the standards of her family, peacefully. The hall she left behind did not fare as well. In 1760, more than 2 centuries after her death, a fire swept through Rochford Hall, destroying much of the original structure. The south wing was lost entirely. What remained of the north wing was left to decay, abandoned and gradually forgotten. It was in these ruined wings that reports of unexplained activity began to accumulate. Visitors and locals described a poltergeist disturbance most often described as objects being thrown by an unseen hand at anyone who ventured too far into the ruins. Alongside this, witnesses reported a headless figure in grey Tudor-era clothing moving through the grounds, accompanied by a drop in temperature, severe enough that some described feeling as though they had stepped into a freezer. Of all the family, Mary's death was the only one that came without violence or scandal attached to it. Perhaps for that reason, her name is rarely the one spoken when the hauntings of Rochford Hall are discussed, even though the ruins remain there still, and the reports, however they are explained, have never entirely stopped. 5 members of one family, each tied to the same series of events in the spring of 1536 and the years that followed. A father who said nothing, a brother executed for a crime that likely never happened, a queen whose fall reshaped a nation, a sister-in-law consumed by her own testimony, and an eldest daughter who escaped the worst of it, only to have her name attached to a ruin that outlived her by centuries. Thank you for watching. Good night.